In this series of videos, we will discuss about the structure of the female reproductive system, placenta, and mammary glands. The learning objectives of this lecture are listed here. Now, this schematic shows the posterior view of the female internal sex organs, which are the ovaries, the uterine tube, the uterus, and the vagina. The ovaries, uterine tubes, and the uterus, they undergo marked structural and functional changes during each menstrual cycle and during pregnancy. Now, if you look at the ovaries, they are paired structures, one here and one on the other side. They are almond-shaped, and each ovary is attached to the posterior surface of the broad ligament. Now, the ovaries have two interrelated functions. The one is the production of gametes. The second one is the production of steroid hormones, the estrogens and progesterones. Now let's look at the uterine tubes or oviducts. The one end of the oviduct or the uterine tubes is adjacent to the ovary, while the other end communicates with the uterine cavity here. And it can be divided into the four major parts. The first one is the infundibulum, second one is the ampullary region, third is isthmus, and the intramural, which goes into the uterine tube. Now, the uterus. The uterus is a kind of a hollow organ. The body and can be divided into the two regions. The body is the large upper portion of the uterus. Now, the rounded part of the uterus, which is basically above the attachment site of the uterine, is called fundus of the uterus, while the narrower part or the barrel-shaped part of the uterus is called cervix, which projects into the vagina. Now, let's look at the structure of the ovaries. The ovaries are paired and are suspended by the ovarian ligament. Now, the surface of the ovary is covered by a single layer of cuboidal cells, also known as germinal epithelium. Now, the germ cells, which are oocytes or eggs, they are of extragonadal origin. They migrate into the ovary from the yolk sac. If you cut a section through the ovary, you're going to see two regions. One is the cortex of the ovary, which is peripheral part and contains the ovarian follicles, and these follicles contain oocytes. Now, the follicles, which are situated just underneath the cuboidal epithelium, and a very thin fibrous layer called tunica albuginea. The central part of the ovary called the medulla, and the medullary part contains loose connective tissue and a mass of relatively large blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves. The boundary between the medullary part and the cortex is indistinct. This diagram also shows you stages of follicular development from the primary follicle towards the mature or Graafian follicle, as shown here by the arrow. Now, after ovulation, the changes in the follicle leads to the development of corpus haemorrhagicum, corpus luteum, and eventually corpus albicans. Now let's look at the stages of follicle development. The ovarian follicle provides the microenvironment for these developing oocytes. Now, histologically, three basic types of ovarian follicles can be identified on the basis of developmental stages. The first one is primordial, second one is growing follicles, and the third one is a mature follicle or Graafian follicle. The growing follicle category you can subcategorize into as a primary as well as the secondary follicles. Now, in the cycling ovary, The follicles are found at all stages of development, but primordial follicles predominate, which you are looking here. Now, these primordial follicles are the earliest stage of follicular development, and the primordial follicle is surrounded by a follicular cell, a single layer of follicular cell, and the morphology of these follicular cell is very flattened or low cuboidal. Now, these follicle cells, these are basically surrounded by or bounded by a basal lamina here. The oocyte, which you see here, is arrested in the prophase of the first meiotic division. The ooplasm contain characteristic organelles, including bulb antibody, which is essentially accumulation of Golgi membranes. Also interesting here is the eccentric position of the nucleus, as you can see here in this section of primordial follicles. Now, transition from primordial to primary follicle is largely under local paracrine control, and also several growth factors play important role in this transition. Now, in the transition to a primary follicle, there are some very important changes in the appearance of the follicle. The follicle cells, they enlarge to become a simple cuboidal epithelium around the oocyte. Now, with this transition, they are called granulosa cells. Originally seen as a single layer, they will grow and they form multiple layers. Now, the oocyte also grows and it secretes a specific proteins that are assembled into an extracellular coat called the zona pellucida, which you can see here. Now, zona pellucida contains proteins that act as spermatocyte receptors, very important for the normal fertilization. The cuboidal nature of the follicular cells can be seen in this section of the primary follicle. In addition to these changes, the stromal cells surrounding this follicle also begin to organize into two layers, theca interna and theca externa. Although they are not clearly seen as two distinct layers, the theca interna is the inner highly vascularized layer of the cuboidal secretory cells, and they possess a large number of luteinizing hormone receptors. While the theca externa, which is the outer layer of connective tissue cells, consists of fibroblast, collagen fibers, and smooth muscle cells. Now, oocyte also goes through a maturation process here and started to exhibit a kind of specialized secretory vesicles known as cortical granules. These granules, they contain proteases that are released by exocytosis when the ovum is activated by the sperm during fertilization. Here you're looking at a late primary follicle where you can see the cortical granules in the oocyte and multiple layers of the granulosa cells on this schematic, as well as here on the this section of the primary follicle. Zona pellucida is also very well developed here. Now let's look at the transition from primary follicle to the secondary follicles. The primary follicles, they migrate towards the medullary part of the ovary as they are becoming secondary follicles. Now, the major change that distinguishes the secondary from primary follicle is the separation of granulosa cells, which you see here, multiple layers of granulosa cells, and they start separating from one another. Now, as the spaces grow, continue to enlarge and eventually coalesce to form a single fluid-filled space called the antrum. Here's another view of a secondary follicle. What you can see here, fluid-filled space, the antrum, granulosa cells, and these changes which basically transitioning from the primary to the secondary. They are dependent on the influence of the follicle stimulating hormone and other growth factors such as EGF and IGF. The thicker layer, interna and the externa around the follicle, they also continue to develop during this stage. Now let's look at the last stage of the follicular development, which is the mature follicle, or also known as a Graafian follicle. Now this follicle has a diameter of 10 millimeter or more, and they are much larger than the early stages or the secondary follicle. Now because of its large size, it causes a bulge on the surface of the ovary. Now, this large size is because of the increase in size of the fluid-filled space or antrum here, which you can see on this schematic or in this section. It's pretty big. Now, if you look at the granulosa cell layer, they're very uniform in this follicle. And if you look at this section also here, and actually granulosa cells layer, they decrease from the previous stage, which is the secondary follicle. Now the oocyte protrudes into the antrum, is surrounded by granulosa cells, and these cells, they form a thickened mound, also referred as a cumulus oophorus here, as you can see on this section also. Now the granulosa cells, which are immediately surround the oocyte and remain with it after ovulation, they are referred as a corona radiata. Now, the thecal layers also continue to thicken, and the theca interna becomes more vascularized around this follicle. The theca interna cells, they produce androgen under the influence of luteinizing hormone, and these androgens, they are converted to estrogen under the influence of follicular stimulating hormone. Here's another view of a mature or a Graafian follicle, a big antrum filled with the follicular fluid. The oocyte protrudes into the antrum, and the granulosa cells make this mound called the cumulus oophorus. And if you see these granulosa cells, they are very uniform around the antrum. Now, the basal lamina, which separates the granulosa cells from the thecal layer. Theca interna, which is highly vascularized, just outside the basal lamina, and outside of theca interna is theca external layer.